Welcome to the Clifton Worley Show. This week we have Chris Bellamy as our guest. Hi, Chris.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, same.
We met at Summer Nam in Nashville. I think back in July, and got to eat lunch a few times and hang out. And so, but I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce you to our guest and to kind of get your story. Now you're a guitarist,
Yep, sure am.
and I mean you play like professionally, and you teach, and you work at a church, and so I mean that's your bread and butter.
Yeah, that yeah, playing session work, touring. I'm on staff at a church when I'm home, and I teach, and then also do like clinics and conferences, and all that together somehow makes me a musician, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I noticed something too that I did not know about you is that you also play saxophone professionally.
Yep. Yeah, I spent a long time um trying to get myself known as a guitar player instead of a sax player because I was pretty well known in my circle as a sax player, and so I just stopped talking about it, posting about it. Anything I did, I would still play sax, but I wouldn't put it on social media. And then recently, people are like, "How come you never talk about your sax playing?" And I was like, "I don't know. I just got so used to talking about guitar, and everybody's kind of seems to be more interested in seeing pics about pedal boards and guitars than saxophones." So then I kind of made a decision recently, like, okay, I'm gonna stop ignoring my saxophone with the as far as social media goes. And a lot of people have been recently saying, I didn't know you played sax. And so, yeah, that's been a recent thing.
Yeah. Well, I know that there's a lot more guitar culture than there is, saxophone or band instrument culture. But when it comes down to the work, I mean, where are the opportunities?
Um, that's Man, it's weird because you know, you just after years and years of meeting people, it's always just you play a gig or you do a session and you meet somebody, and then like randomly 2 years later they'll be like, "Hey man, can you do this?" And so it's like this weird spider web of a network that ends up being turning into work.
Mm-hmm.
And it always I always think like when I do something like, man, that didn't really amount to anything, whatever, you kind of forget about it. And then you'll get something like a year later where somebody was like, "Hey, I was at that show. I was wondering if you could do this," and it's like, wow, I didn't even know anybody was there paying attention. So
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you make because I find that no matter what you do, it's that network we have that you might do something, and you meet somebody and you forget about them, and then later on, it can develop into a business relationship, and
yeah.
the music business is just like that as well. Well, let's wind back and go to where did this all like? I'm sure you grew up playing instruments. Kind of where did all that begin?
So my dad is a violin maker, like,
Oh wow.
and by maker I mean like hand makes everything, not like some guitar makers build guitars. He actually like makes them from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so when I was one and a half, he had me starting violin lessons. And so I remember, well, I don't remember it, but I remember finding it later. It was a cereal box with a ruler sticking out of it with two pencils and a long stick. And apparently what they do is they just for like months they just have you bowing with this cereal box with a ruler sticking out of it, and just trying to get your right arm in the proper form.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess when I was like 2.5, I got a real violin, but it was like miniature. And so I grew up doing this. I don't know if you've heard of this method called Suzuki. It's like a Japanese method.
Yes, my sister-in-law did that when she was a kid.
Yeah, and it's pretty crazy because you can teach like super young kids, like babies, like how to play music. And so I did that for years. And then I guess when I think it was like 8 or 9, my dad, he was so connected in the violin world that he got me a teacher from Juilliard, and her name was Dora Mullins, and I switched over to her. And I absolutely hated violin at the time. I remember just crying, like every night crying. And my only inspiration for practicing was if I practiced 20 times in a row, I would get a G.I. Joe figure. And that was like my whole goal in life, was to get these G.I. Joe figures. And so that's how I learned how to play music. Eventually, like I think when I was like maybe middle school, then he started me on piano lessons. And so I was taking piano lessons, or maybe it was earlier than that. But for a little while, I was taking piano and violin. And then I remember in school, like the sixth graders came and did a concert for the school, and they played the song Kokomo by the Beach Boys. You know that song?
Yeah.
And like in the middle of it, like the sax player stood up and did a sax solo, and I was like, I don't know what that gold thing is, but I want that, and I want to do that. Like I'm done with violin and piano, and I want to do that. And so I started playing sax, and so for a while I was doing all three. And my parents noticed that I really liked sax, and so eventually they agreed to let me quit the other two. So I think I did guitar. I keep saying guitar, violin and piano for about 13 years, and then finally just settled on sax, and then really pursued it. And in high school, I was super competitive, and I got to be. I made it to like number 1 in the state. Led me to a music scholarship to Old Dominion University. And then when I got there, I was number 1 in the state for college level sax playing. And that kind of landed me a bunch of gigs like while I was still in college.
Yeah. Well, so you predominantly did the saxophone thing going through school, and then you ended up going to Old Dominion University. What'd you study there?
Music, performance, and education. I did a dual track.
Yeah.
And so, but the funny thing is, there were, like, my dad also played like in bluegrass bands.
Okay.
And so he played guitar as well. He had like guitars and banjos and stuff. And I don't even know when I started playing guitar. I mean, I have pictures of me playing a guitar when I was like in diapers still. Just, I don't know if I was actually playing it or just holding it, but they would just be around the house. And so my dad kind of showed me how to play guitar growing up. And so guitar was kind of, I guess I would associate it to like having a basketball hoop outside, and you kind of just, you're not really on a team or anything, but you just go out and just shoot around every once in a while. And then, you know, it kind of part of me growing up. I never really took it seriously until I think it was when like Stone Temple Pilots and Lenny Kravitz got popular.
Okay.
And when I saw Are You Gonna Go My Way, the video for that, where Lenny Kravitz is like in this big like circular pit and people are going crazy and he's got a flying V, that's when I was like, okay, like I want to take this seriously. I want to be that guy.
Yeah.
So yeah, so guitar was kind of on. It was kind of like a thing I did on the side. Like I'd play in bands on the side, but I didn't really think of it as my primary thing because sax had been always what propelled me and like what I competed with, and everybody knew me as a sax player. So guitar was kind of a hobby to me. But when I finished my saxophone requirements at Old Dominion, I noticed that sax just wasn't that popular at that time. Aside from like a couple of ska bands, I guess like the Supertone, or not, was it the Supertones? The Boss Tones,
Yeah,
Mighty Boss Tones.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get those two confused. They were popular, and that was pretty much like the only kind of sax stuff that was going on. Like jazz had kind of like, nobody really was like listening to jazz around me, except for the guys in my classes, and I was scared that I was setting myself up for like a sinking instrument, And so I decided I was just going to start over with guitar. I'm going to take all the classes over again on guitar. And so I started at the beginning, and my professors thought I was absolutely crazy. They're like, "What are you doing?" Like, I remember my advisor said, he literally said, "Guitar is not a real instrument. What do you like? Why? What are you thinking?" And but I was just like, no, I really feel like I need to get my guitar playing up to my sax playing, and I need I want to be known for both. And I felt like if I did both, then I could get gigs, like, because I'd seen people playing guitar but also be the sax player, And so I thought maybe that could set me apart from people that are just guitar players or just sax players. So I did classical guitar, and I did all the juries and all the recitals and everything, and kind of made a fool of myself for a first semester, but because it was so rudimentary. But eventually got it all up after a couple years, got it where I felt like it was even, and I started taking. There wasn't a jazz guitar professor at my school, so I took it from a guy from Berkeley. And just kept pushing until I got my guitar to a pretty equal place where my sax playing was. So there was always like things in my head that I knew as a musician, but I couldn't translate it to guitar, and that was my goal, was to be able to not be stifled because of the guitars in front of me versus the saxophone. So
Right. Well, let's talk about for a minute. So you've got all these educational opportunities, to pursue the saxophone, and then you take on the guitar. But I want to know what's happening, in the meantime, while you're getting your guitar playing up to par. Are you playing in bands out like while you're doing this? And
my mentor, my sax mentor, he's a really well-known saxophonist and woodwind specialist in the world. And he helped me get a ton of gigs. Like he helped me get a gig with the Virginia Symphony, which was a pretty cutthroat audition. And then from there, I got some gigs with some pretty heavy musicians, or artists rather, like Gladys Knight, Linda Ronstadt, Tony Tennille, Bob Mincer. And it's funny because I kind of stopped telling people this because so like I'll have students, they'll be like, "Who's the most famous person you played with?" And I was like, "Well, I played for Gladys Knight," and they're like, "Who?" And so like,
yeah.
And so there's barely anybody now. Like most people don't know who Captain and Tennille is unless they're like above the age of 55. But people that are older are like super impressed by this stuff.
Yeah.
But so, for a while I didn't even have it on my bio because it got to the point where it's like people are like, "Who are these people?" Yeah, so it just gave me some really great experience. But in the music world, when you talk to producers and stuff, and they're like, "Wait, you played with Gladys Knight?" And they know exactly who that is, But yeah, kids these days don't know anything about who the Pips are, or So
Yeah. Well, so yeah, and you're right. Like, if it's not like the a pop artist in the last 10 years, sometimes it's hard to for kids to relate to that music. But that's a lot of the foundations for the pop music that they're listening to.
right, yeah.
So when did you make that shift to pursue the guitar playing, or kind of like you said, kind of dial back talking about the saxophone?
So um, I got. It's funny. I got offered to do the Temptations. We're going to do a reunion tour,
Mm-hmm.
and I got offered to do that gig. Um, and I remember specifically, um, I had a church event, um, and I was playing guitar for that. And I remember I told the contractor that I couldn't do the gig because I had this church event, and he thought I was just crazy. And I was like, well, I made this commitment, whatever. And I usually, well, to this day, I don't think I've ever made a commitment as far as a gig and then backed out for a bigger gig.
Okay.
And I've actually lost out on. Sometimes I wonder maybe I should have, um, but yeah, I don't know. It kind of bugs me when people they'll dip out on a gig for a bigger gig at the last minute. And so I told him, I was like, well, I just feel strongly about that. And he was like, you're stupid. And he's like, I'm literally never going to call you again for any gigs if you turn this down. And he said, this might be the biggest gig of your life. And I was like, well, I'm sorry. This is my, my ethically, I felt like I shouldn't do it. And it didn't have anything to do with it being a church gig or anything. It was just that I'd made a commitment. And so he literally didn't call me again. And so I was like, okay. And so I still had stuff on the side, but this was the guy that contracted me for all of the big name artists that would come through. And so, and then right after that, my wife got real sick, and she was diagnosed with a disease called Hughes syndrome, and it's like a blood disease.
Okay.
And I started selling all of my instruments, and so I sold my saxes, and I sold all my guitars, all my amps except for one guitar and one amp, and I kept one saxophone. But I think I sold like 10 guitars, 3 amps, 3 saxophones, and like all my pedals, and because she just had so much medical bills.
Right.
And from that, right around that time, I was thinking like, man, I need to get something a little more steady. And so I went on staff at a church, and then I took a teaching gig at this really, I guess the word is just a rich school in my area. It's like the most prestigious school in Virginia. And so I just did that for a long time, and kind of stayed away from like going on the road, and just kind of stayed home with my wife, and we just kind of got through it. And after 3 years of that, I think, dealing with that, she was finally went to the doctor, and they said that she didn't have it anymore, and she was healed.
Awesome.
It was pretty much a miracle, and it kind of just changed our trajectory. At the time, I was looking at maybe moving to LA or New York City, and then we were like, okay, let's just kind of settle down. And so I thought, in my head, well, I'll just stay home and just do I'll do whatever I need to do. If I could just stay home and do session work or just teach or whatever. And so I did that for a while. I think I had like 48 students a week. And I had a waiting list, and I just kept getting more and more students, and it was pretty good money. but I just wasn't super happy, you know. So then I met a couple people. I met a guy named Jason Bear from Charlotte, North Carolina, through a radio station. I was also DJing at a radio station once a week.
Okay.
And I met him, and he found out because he's a well-trained vocalist, and he found out that I had done stuff with Tony Tennille and Gladys Knight and everything, and he actually knew who they were. And he was like, "Why are you not like touring anymore?" And I was like, "Yeah, I kind of, I thought kind of retired at the time." And he was like, "Well, I've got a tour coming up, and my guitar player is he can't do it, and can you do it?" And I was like, "Probably. When is it?" And he was like, "Well, we leave in like 2 days." And so I talked to my wife, and I was like, "Man," and so I was like, let's do it, because she's kind of doing pretty good, health wise, and everything was okay, and so I did it, and kind of went back on the road, and I met his producer, and this is kind of where everything changed. So his producer, his name is Aaron Rice, and he's really well known in Nashville. He's done a lot of work with like he wrote the song "Good Morning" by Mandisa. Do you know that song?
Yes.
So he wrote that, and he wrote "Made to Love" by Toby Mac.
Okay.
Or was one of the writers on that, and he's worked with a lot of American Idol artists, and I met him. I went to Nashville with Jason, and I remember Jason saying, like, "You gotta be careful what you say to Aaron, because he's probably not gonna like you." And I was like, "Why wouldn't he like me?" And he's like, "Oh, he doesn't really like many people." And like after like 10 minutes, like we were just like busting out laughing and telling jokes and everything. And like Jason was kind of floored. Like he's like, "Why is he like you so much?" And I was like, "I don't know. I guess we just had similar personalities, and we got to know each other." And so I started doing work for him, and like recording for different projects he had, different artists, and then. From there, I met Elisa Turner, who's now with Integrity.
Okay.
And she's kind of blowing up right now. And I met Jeremy Rosado, who's he was on, I forget what season of American Idol he was on, but he was on one of the American Idols, one of the finalists. And I did a tour. I think I've done maybe 2 or 3 tours with him. I met this band called People of the Earth. They were based out of Nashville in Kentucky. And so, yeah, just meeting Aaron had kind of like spiderwebbed into like tons of things. And then I would just meet other people, and then we would have so many mutual friends like in Nashville that you just kind of, once you're like, I guess in that space where you have a couple friends and they're like, "Oh, this person, you must be cool," or you know this person, well, oh, then you're my friend, because you know this person. So and so that's it, kind of resurrected me touring and doing session work again. So that was maybe like 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay. Now, in the middle of all this, like you're still teaching and working with the church when you're home, right?
Yep. But not as much. But when I first got on staff at my church, it was just me. There was barely any. I think maybe like 5 people in the music ministry. Mm-hmm. And they all quit because they didn't like the way I guess I came with like a professional background, and I had completely different expectations, and everybody quit. And so I just started rebuilding. And it took me a long time, but that time where I wasn't going out on the road, I just spent, trying to build up musicians. And I taught a lot of like high school kids and kind of poured into them, and so now they're like in their mid 20s and they're like, some are music majors and have graduated and are just fantastic musicians. And like one of the drummers now he plays with me like on a lot of things I do on the road. And so I tried to build up this teams that could function without me, if that makes sense.
I like that. Yeah.
And so I built up 3 teams, so that because I didn't want people to get burnt out, and so I built up 3 teams, and so people weren't having to play or serve, every week, and then just kind of got some of them connected with people that I knew, and I guess people were excited because I brought a level of professionalism to the team, and so now it works pretty well because when I'm gone, it functions fine. And my wife actually she does like production managing, and
Okay.
so she can stay home and like make sure everything gets done while I'm gone. And so I have a great relationship with my church that allows me to travel, and they see the value in allowing me to play with artists and travel and kind of bring that knowledge back. So
And
it works out.
That's incredible, actually. Yeah, that's what I work at a church full time and work as the youth and worship leader. And I've been there for about 7 years now, and I'm kind of like you in that regard. Like I'm kind of thinking out how can I have the same thing go on when I'm gone.
Yeah.
Like this year I've been gone like more than I ever have, like on trips and stuff. And what if you don't mind, if I could pick your brain a minute on that, like what kind of things did you take in place to try to ensure that the same level happened without you physically being there?
Um, it was a long process. It probably took 5 years to get it really kind of going.
Mm-hmm.
But I went to our youth group, and I was like, I want to know who takes piano lessons, who's in band, who's in orchestra, and who's in choir at your school. And every single person took them. Like, all right, here you this, you're gonna learn this, you're gonna learn this, and so I got kids that kind of already had training, and just figured out how to get them in a team, and I would bring them in for our main players, like once or twice a month, to the point where they kind of got on an equal playing level as the main players, and I just kept doing that, and then I got some people together, like probably 3 guys, and I was like, hey, I consider you guys like the top players, and I want to kind of mentor you guys in like actually leading the team. And so I would go to rehearsals, but let them lead, and I would kind of just stay upstairs in the mezzanine and kind of watch. And then like I'd text them stuff like, hey, make sure this, make sure that, but it seemed like they were leading the team. And so it got to the point where they could lead and they could function. And then my wife has a team of 4 people that are production managers. And so every week they have like they're walking around with a clipboard. And I got this from, are you familiar with the Creation Festivals?
Yeah.
It's like the the largest Christian festival. So I played the Creation Festivals for a few years, and there's those things are huge. There's like 90 to 100,000 people out there, and when I played, I noticed there was always this girl walking around with a clipboard and a headset, and so I just kind of befriended her, and I was like, hey, what are you doing? Like I was interested in what was going on behind the scenes, and how could I'm always like trying to find what can I steal from professional situations and bring it back to my church, to make things easier. And so she was like the stage and production manager, and she showed me like basically I'll be talking to her while other bands were going on, and she's like got this clipboard with all these things that needs to be done. And I got a copy of that and figured out how to translate that into my church service. And
That's awesome.
so my wife will have this clipboard, and it'll say like, okay, at 9 o'clock, check the temperature. 9:05, turn on, make sure the video team turns on the cameras at 9:10. Make sure the musicians are there at 9:15. Make sure the singers are warming up. Like kind of just like every 5 minutes, kind of making sure things are happening. So it got to the point where I could kind of worry more about the overall services and
Mm-hmm.
less about like the details, and then they would worry about the details. So yeah, those two things really made it like possible for me to still travel.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And you mentioned something I'd like to go back to just now. You mentioned clearing your head and putting some responsibilities on some other people so that you can focus on the task at hand. Like in this case, leading worship. I find that is a pitfall for so many worship leaders, and that's something I struggled with in my early years. Was I had my head so wrapped around with making sure the band was making all the changes and going up and down in the dynamics and the transitions in from songs that at times I simply forgot to worship.
Yeah,
And that's something that I think as worship leaders they have to grow through and realize, and there's such a freedom with that, like getting to the point where, you know what, I'm not going to worry about, I mean, the technical stuff's important, but we're going to work that out, but let's go on to really why we're here and what we're doing,
yeah,
and focus in on that because that's the sense of accomplishment from a worship leader,
yeah,
is knowing that you helped, foster congregational singing and help bring people into the presence of the Lord while you're a worship leader.
yeah, yeah. I noticed like from kind of doing all this professional work, there's like this huge difference where, say you're playing with an artist, that artist is not sitting there making sure everybody shows up. The artist is not making, like running the band and like changing transitions. The artist kind of floats in, does her thing, and then leaves. And then you have people that are in charge of the lighting, and people in charge of the production, and people in charge of the band, another person in charge of the making sure people are on time, whatever. So, and but then you come to church, and a lot of churches have just this one worship leader that's doing all of that,
Yeah.
and it's like, how can that person lead or concentrate on leading worship or singing if they're worried about like, is the lighting guy gonna be there, or is this, or is the air conditioning correct right now? And it's like they're thinking about a million things, and so I just was like, man, there's got to be a way to use how secular productions work. And I also did a lot of like musicals, like Broadway type stuff,
Mm-hmm.
or off Broadway, and I just saw how everything ran, and it was so different than church, where it's just like people aren't micromanaging things. There's like, okay, this person's in charge of this, and that's what they concentrate on, and so I try to get my church to be more like that. And my church is small, not a big church at all. It's like it's less than 500 people, so it's not like it doesn't take a lot to get it running,
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I still believe that everybody could act professional and learn how to be professional, and I think it's helped because a lot of the people on my team have gone on to do professional things, and I think it's helped them prepare for that. So
That's awesome, and I think that's important. Like as a leader, is to get to the point where people are reproducing, and a lot of times, if you're working with teenagers or young people, you're pouring into them, and kind of the expectation is that they'll go on to do bigger and better things, maybe outside your context. And
yeah,
so you got to be prepared for that as a leader. But it's awesome to see kids go on and do things and do it well. outside the context of your own church.
Definitely.
Well, let's talk a minute about your location. Now you're in Virginia Beach, and I'm sure that there is a music scene there, but it's not like you're in New York City or L.A. or
Right.
Nashville. How do you? I'm sure you do a lot of traveling, but has that been an opportunity, or has it been like a hurdle to try to work from a distance?
Um, so yeah, that's a great question because people don't know Virginia Beach is the largest resort city in the world. So it's this huge um, um, tourist
Mm-hmm.
place. You know what I mean? And it's got the longest pleasure beach on the world. So like it's just miles and miles of like hotels and nice beach and um, there's just like tons of tourists here, and it's always rated like the number one place to raise a family, which is ironic because I don't have any kids, but it's it's just like I don't know, it's pretty great place to live, and everybody that comes here, they love it. You know, they love it's just kind of like being on vacation, and so I grew up here, and I it's hard for me when I travel to not be like to be landlocked. Like when I go to Nashville, I feel so far away from the ocean and I start feeling it. Like I feel like trapped. Um,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
so I love it here. But at the same time, the music scene is terrible. Like, like all the great jazz clubs have lasted maybe 2 years, you know, and they always shut down. Um, it does have a really good, like a couple really good venues. It's got this club that's about a medium size called the Norva, and I love playing there because it's like the perfect size club. It can fit about I think 1,500 to 2,000 people. Rolling Stone rated it like the number one club in America a couple years back, but um, they've got that, and they've got an amphitheater that seats about like 30,000 people. But other than that, like the music scene, aside from just like big name country artists and pop artists coming through, the local music scene, it struggles. It's definitely not like it's like in New York or LA or Nashville. And so that's why um, I actually don't really play a lot around this area. Like all my family is like, how come you never play around here? When can I see you play? You know? And it's just because it's not like that. So I was, well, I still do. I go to Nashville a lot. But a little while ago, maybe 2 years ago, I was going back and forth to Nashville to record with Aaron Rice, and I started noticing that every time I record, I would use the same signal chain. They would, you know, same pre's, same compressors, same mics, everything. And I was like, well, I could just buy that stuff and record at my house, you know. And I had like a studio, but I didn't have that same setup. And so I sold a couple things and then started buying some studio gear. Um, and I got the same preamps, which is the A Designs Pacifica. And I got four of those, and then I got some 1176 compressors, and I got, you know, two Royer mics,
Mm-hmm.
The 121 ribbons, and then a couple Heil mics, and a couple SM57s that I already had. And I just recreated the exact same signal chain. And then I have a like an Apollo rack interface. And I when I was in college, I took Pro Tools classes, and so I knew my way around Pro Tools, and I was certified. But everybody I was working with was using Logic, and I was like, man, it's just different, you know. And so I forced myself like 2 years ago to just stop using Pro Tools and start using Logic, and I felt like an infant. But I knew what I wanted to do, but it was kind of like when I started focusing on guitar. It's like I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to translate it, and
Right.
so I just forced myself to use Logic. And so now I think I actually let my Pro Tools contract lapse like last month because I haven't used it, and just everybody I work with uses Logic, so now I can just track at home a lot easier and a lot faster and do albums without having to fly to Nashville and bring all my my pedal board and borrow amps. I was borrowing like amps from a friend of mine over there, and um, it's just way easier, and I get things done a lot faster. So
Yeah, and that's a really good call, because I don't remember where I saw this recently, but it was a young man. He was talking about, it was like one of these gear forums, and he was talking about, hey, I'm gonna move to Nashville. I really want to immerse myself in that. Any tips from you pro guys, And there were people saying, yeah, you need to do that. You'll get better than you ever have been before, and I agree with that. But then there was some voices of reason in there that was saying the opposite. It was like, unless like you just know you're gonna like land in country music, you don't have to be in Nashville. You could be anywhere, and use that as your base. It's so I don't know. It's a mix, because they're definitely, the people are there, the connections that you need to make are there, but it doesn't. It's even more so now, like that people can work remotely. You don't have to live there.
yeah. Then I've seen so many people move there without connections, and they will just float around aimlessly for years. And if you don't have the connections, Nashville is going to do absolutely nothing for you. Like literally, I remember, I think it was two summer NAMs ago. I was out there with Rick Matthews.
Yeah.
And we went down the street. We were looking for a coffee shop, and we found this kind of like, I guess it was like a juice cold press type coffee and juice bar.
Mm-hmm.
And we're sitting there, and sitting at the bar, and we were drinking coffees. And the guy, he goes, so are you guys here for NAM? And I was like, yeah, how'd you know? And he's like, is your name Chris? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, yeah, I follow you on social media. And I was like, really? Like, that's so weird, like
Mm-hmm.
that you recognize me. And he's like, yeah, well, I'm a guitar player. And I was like, oh, cool. And he's like, I was like, well, this is Rick Matthews. And he's like, from Matthews Effects. And I was like, yeah. And he was like, and he totally knew who he was too, but he didn't recognize his face. And we did the whole joke about like he thought his name was Matthew, and versus Rick. And so I'm talking. I'm like, so what are you doing? Like, what are you doing here? And he's like, well, I moved here 5 years ago, and I've just been trying to, I'm a guitar player, and I've just been trying to kind of get my foot in the door. And I was like, well, so what are you doing? And he's like, well, I'm just working at this coffee shop. And I was like, are you playing any gigs or anything? He's like, nah, not really. I'm just still trying to get to know people. And I was like, dang, you've been here for 5 years.
Yeah.
And you still you don't know anybody yet, And I don't live there, but the fact that I met a couple people that introduced me to a lot of people, like I don't even live there, and I have this huge network versus a person that lived there for 5 years. And it just showed, it's like, man, if you don't know people, that like the whole music industry is based on knowing people. And if you don't have those connections, you will just go in circles trying to figure out what you're going to do and meet those connections. And it's crazy, And so I felt bad, like I was like, man, like I wish I could do something for him or something, like introduce him to somebody. I was like, well, you should come to NAMM. And he's like, well, I don't have a pass. And I'm like, well, it was great talking to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but yeah, man, it's kind of like a reminder that without those connections,
Yeah.
like, man, it doesn't matter where you live now, but it's the connections that make the difference.
Yeah, you make a very valid point, and I think about this movie with Jim Carrey in it, The Yes Man.
Yeah.
Where he makes a decision, and it's crazy, like the circumstances that lead to it in the movie, but makes a decision that he's just going to say yes to everything that comes in front of him. And it takes this, like reclusive guy who doesn't have a lot going on for him in life to the point where he has this huge circle of friends and all these opportunities start happening for him. And when I saw that movie, I didn't take it too seriously, but in my mind, I was like, it doesn't hurt to do things that you don't absolutely want to be doing, that you don't envision, hey, this is going to lead to this. But like just saying yes to some things, if it's a, substandard gig or if it comes a worst bleed and you're asked to play somewhere and you don't really, know what that's going to be like saying yeah, because you never know, like a year or two down the road, like you were saying, like, it might lead to something else. And so if you're anybody who's serious about, trying to make a living out of whatever, if it's music or business or whatever, like saying yes to some things does not hurt.
Yeah, I read I forget who it was. It's one of the I always read I love reading articles about like the session guys and touring guys for the whole country scene.
Uh-huh.
And there's a lot of like podcasts and blogs about just their life and stuff. And I remember reading somebody's, I forget who it was, but it was a touring guy that's pretty well known. And he said that they were like, what, how'd you get started? And he said, I would just say yes to everything. I didn't care if it was like a $5 gig. I would say yes. And I would just play every single gig that came across my plate. And I would just try to be cool with everybody, Mm-hmm. And that was what got me the gig. And that's another thing is, like in Nashville, everybody is an awesome player. Like everybody's a monster player. But not everybody's cool to hang out with. And
absolutely,
like I found that most artists care more about how you are for the other 23 hours of a day if you're on tour with them, versus how well of a player you are, because you just assumed you're a good player, but it's the other 23 hours that they will hire you for. So like if you're not cool to be around, or like you can't socialize like and be like a good hang basically, then you're not going to get the gig, And so I've gotten gigs over people that I may have thought like, well, they're better than me, but they were just kind of a little pretentious, or just not fun to hang around. And so
yeah, because
the personality thing is everything.
Absolutely, because they're working with you. I mean, it's like if you were working in an office and you have somebody who's really sour and a Debbie Downer, like you don't want to be around them all day long, or even eat lunch with them. And that's the same thing. Like it's not any different than like an artist. They want to be around with people who are going to be positive and not drag them down. And when it comes to them being able to do their job, they don't want to have to think about all the weird interpersonal conflicts that may arise.
Yeah, I mean, I know so many drummers. It seems like drummers are always kind of, some have either figured this out or haven't figured it out, and some are just monster players that can like do fills for days, and some are just groove players. And all the ones that I know that are doing like just really big gigs like on tour are the ones that they're just kind of awesome groove players, but they are super nice people, and they're fun to be around. So, being on a tour bus with them or being in hotels with them is enjoyable versus just some guy that's like playing monster fills but sour for the rest of the day.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think about too, like I heard Buddy Miller say this in an interview one time about how a lot of his gigs early on, in like where he would go from like playing, the club circuit to going on to play for some bigger artists, were literally like just he happened to be sitting down next to somebody somewhere, and they were, hey, what do you do? I play guitar. oh well, my guitar player is going to be out for a few weeks. Could you come, audition or whatever? And just being available. And I think that's one of those things that when I was younger, probably one of my biggest pitfalls was I had this idealism that if I wasn't going to play with anybody if it wasn't like exactly the kind of music I wanted to play, or I wasn't gonna play this gig if it did this or whatever, and like I really really like put roadblocks in front of my playing. And when it got to like later on in life, when I like saw friends who had gone so much further, like in that short amount of time, and I'm leading worship at a church, like I just began to have this attitude as like, no, I'm gonna say yes. I'm gonna be available to do this, because you just never know like where something may lead.
Yeah, yeah. I think every gig I've only done maybe 2 or 3 auditions in my life. Every other gig has always been I'm playing a gig, and I meet somebody on that gig, and that leads to another gig.
Mm-hmm.
So like when I did Creation Fest, I remember the first year I was playing with an artist named Brian Campbell, and there's this guy named Pastor Harry. He's like the guy that founded Creation Fest. He looks like Santa Claus, and he runs the whole festival, like all the East, West, and all the other festivals. And it turned out he's a vintage guitar collector, and I got to know him. And so like every lunch, we played for I think 5 days straight, and every lunch I would go find him and talk to him about his like vintage guitars and everything. And then the next year, I was playing with a different artist named Mike Lee, and Pastor Harry was like, "What are you doing here? Brian Campbell's not here this year." And I was like, "Oh, I'm playing with Mike Lee," and he was like, "Man, you really get around, don't you?" Like he's pulling my leg, like basically saying like I'm hopping around. But I had met Mike Lee that first year, just side stage, just talking to him. I remember the reason I met him is because his kids were running around, and his kids like kicked some rocks like in my face, and his wife was like so apologetic, and I was like, "Nah, it's cool," and like we became friends. And then the next year, he was like, "Hey, you want to play Creation Fest with us?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And so I was back, and yeah, Pastor Harry was just he was just really joking me, because he's like. He's just, every day he would see me. He's like, "So who are you playing with today?" Like he'd act like I was playing with a different band every day or something. But
Well, that's an interesting point. And I see a lot of guys who are, full-time musicians, how diversified they have to stay, because it's like I saw some guy, I can't remember who, that was saying last week that he was a full-time musician, and when he was on the road, like he would do really well, but like he learned when he got back home, like he had to have some other hustles, because things can get really lean if you're just depending on the tours to get you through. And so what are some of the things you think are good areas to work in, like besides going out and playing live music, like things that keep a musician going?
Well, a thing that I've gone back and forth with is teaching. Like I taught for so long, and I kind of got burnt out with it, and then so I decided like I don't want to teach anymore. And last year I was telling my wife, like I'm just not going to teach. It's too tedious, and it doesn't really, I don't find joy in it anymore. And then I was watching. There's a sax player named Bob Reynolds, and he's the sax player for Snarky Puppy and John Mayer. And he's got he's got a band called the Bob Reynolds Guitar Band, which is him on sax, and then the Snarky Puppy guitar players, and it's they're ridiculously awesome. But he has a great vlog on YouTube, and I watched that, and he just vlogs his whole life, touring, whatever, and playing with John Mayer, playing with Snarky Puppy, and going all over the place. And I noticed he would just try to fit in lessons like wherever he could, and I'm thinking like, who am I? I'm not John Mayer's guitar player or anything. And I'm talking about I don't want to teach lessons. It just kind of slapped me in the face, like, I almost like for a while, for just a brief second, I thought I'm too good to do this, because it sometimes it can feel kind of like babysitting, especially with the young kids,
Yeah.
But I've just seen so many kids like really, go through the college years and come back and be like, hey man, you made a difference in my life, and and that's really cool. But I remember I thought to myself, why if Bob Reynolds can teach lessons, like why am I trying to not teach lessons, and so like pretty much every side man that I know, like touring guy, session guy, they still teach lessons. And so I think that's an important thing. It can kind of humble you too, but it's really great money, and I'd rather be teaching with a guitar in my hand, for $60 an hour versus, driving Lyft or whatever, Uber,
Yeah.
which the funny thing is I know a lot of guys that do that. Like, I know there's a, I don't want to name the band, but there's a super famous artist, and I was talking to the guy, his drummer and his bass player, and they both drive FedEx, went home, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, you guys are like selling out like stadiums like all year long, and you're driving for FedEx. And he's like, man, well, we're home like 3 days a week. I'm not going to just sit around and not do anything. I might as well make some extra money. And I was just blown away by that, by his mindset of like, even though I'm doing these huge things, I'm going to make the most out of my time. So lessons, session work. Session work is tricky though, because you kind of have to, like I said, you have to know the right people, or nobody's gonna hire you. It's usually people that that are gonna hire you. But and then I've done some things like people come over to my studio and record. Like for a while, there was this girl that was with Caleb, and she would come over and she would record all the commercials in my studio. And I would just sit there and track her voice, and she would do all like, hey, you're listening to Caleb. Up next is blah, 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 like, and so, just weird stuff like that. But man, I've had the weirdest things been tracked in my studio. But yeah, just making yourself available. I figure as long as I've got something in my hand, as far as like a guitar, a saxophone, or, a microphone, then I'm kind of good. So
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, I think what the work ethic that, like you mentioned, some of those guys that are out working hard, it's not. I mean, talent is a huge part of it, but it's the work ethic that helps get them there, and helps them stay there too.
Yeah, it's funny. Things that I've learned like 20 years ago will come out, and it's like there's just little pieces that just keep getting built every year, as long as I keep pushing forward, that end up coming out at the weirdest times. Like I did an album for a guy named Sean Lochi. He was in a band called Worth Dying For. And he's the brother of Ryan Lochi, who is the founder of the Church Collective. Okay. And so I met Sean And I think he was with Planet Shakers for a little while, or Henry Seeley, and then he's now in a church out in L.A. and they wanted to do an album, and so he was like, he said, "Can you play like the 1975?" And I was like, "Yeah, I love the 1975. I could definitely do that." And so he had me track for a song, and then like fast forward a year, he ended up making an entire album, and it just came out I think last month, and it has the drummer for the artist The Weeknd.
Okay.
And he's just a monster drummer. I mean, like ridiculous drummer. And the album came out great, but the point of my story is he said he was like he's like for this next song I want like kind of like a M83 vibe on it. And I was like, okay, I can do that. I was like, I can play sax. And he was like, he had no clue I played sax. And he was like, yeah, let's get some sax on here. And I said, okay, so M83 to me is sax plus Steve Vai, because Steve Vai did the M83 album. Mm-hmm. And I was like, so you looking for like Steve Vai type guitars on there? Because that's not really like what I consider church guitar playing, whatever. And he's like, yeah, man. He's like, can you do that? And I was like, sure, And I can't remember the last time where somebody asked me to like shred like 80s style.
Yeah.
And man, I was like a kid in a candy store, and so that's kind of like a skill that I had pushed away for so long. But that plus the sax playing, like it just came out recently, and now some people are asking for that, and so it was cool to have things. It's cool to have things in your back pocket that you may not use. You may not think you're ever going to use, but you'll end up using it like years later,
Absolutely. It's having a skill that somebody else may not have and using that to your advantage,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've gotten here to about an hour, and we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. But
cool. And we didn't even talk about gear.
I tell you what, here we'll carve out a couple minutes. Let's talk about the guitar amp. Okay, you said let's circle back to something you said. You had sold off all your gear except one thing, like one guitar, one amp, several years back. If you had to do that again, what would be your desert island rig?
Now, for the longest time, it was my Bad Cat Black Cat, which was one of the early Samson models that still had like the matchless innards in it.
Okay, yeah.
So it's basically a matchless DC-30 when they first switched over. And that amp has always been like, I'll never get rid of that amp. But it's so stinking heavy. It's like 8 pounds. And I've injured myself twice, like in the hospital from trying to carry that thing. And so that is like my desert island amp. Like I can function with just that amp. But recently, and I kind of wince at even saying this, but recently I was trying to figure out a way to record at night because I just had so much work to do, and I would have to stop around like 9:00 p.m. because the amps would be so loud. And so this is a funny story. So a couple years back, I was in NAMM with TMG guitars, the original TMG guitars.
Okay, yeah.
Like the pre-Jonathan TMG, and we ended up in after one of the evenings of NAMM, we ended up over at David Ryan Harris's house over in like Beverly Hills, and David Ryan Harris is John Mayer's guitar player.
Okay.
And so we were in his studio and we were just hanging out, and he was like, "Hey man, have you ever heard of Kemper?" And I was like, "No, never. I don't know what that is, And he pulled out this thing, looked like a time machine. He was like, "Dude, this thing can hold like 1,000 amps." And I just went just captured all of John Mayer's amps into this thing. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, but it sounds really cool. And so he had profiled all of John Mayer's amps, I guess is what he was saying. And he showed it to me, and it sounded awesome. And I'd always thought about it, but I just was never into anything digital. I just liked analog. I never liked like Line 6 HD 500s and all that stuff. And So recently, like I think maybe a year and a half ago, I was looking for a way to record at night, and another guy I know named um, Tim Reynolds, or not Tim Reynolds, Tim Stewart, um, who plays for Rihanna. He was talking about how he uses a Kemper, and I was like, man, if these guys can use a Kemper, I could at least use it to record. So I picked one up, tried it out, and I was like, this is a great way to record it at night, but whatever, I'll only use it at night over, in the
Mm-hmm.
wee hours of the morning. But man, I gotta say, like I use that thing like almost exclusively, and it's hard to stomach saying that.
So even
Um,
on the road, like, do you bring it on the road?
so on the road, I bring my Kemper and I bring my Bad Cat,
Okay.
if as long as I'm not the one lifting my Bad Cat.
Right.
If we
Right.
have if we have a trailer and everything is ramps and everything, so I bring both, because one time I had the Kemper and the sound guy had accidentally patched me through the artist's ears and not mine, and so I had no sound at all, and it just had the Kemper on stage, and so I was just playing blindly. So I was like, that'll never happen again. So I bring one amp and the Kemper. But man, like if I had to just have one thing, I probably would pick the Kemper now, just because it's so versatile. But yeah, I know it's like people cringe at that, but I'm definitely a believer. But and then guitar wise, my number one guitar for tracking is like my original TMG Gatton, which, like I said, is the old like
Mm-hmm.
it's the one where people might kind of like uh, not even want to talk about it that old. But Jonathan, the new owner of TMG, like swapped out all the parts for the new stuff and like really fixed it up. So it plays amazing. At plus, um, there's a PRS I have. It's a single cut. I don't really bring it out, but I use it to track on everything, and
Mm-hmm.
every note is perfectly in tune. It's got, I think I put the 5708 pickups in it, and it sounds great, and it's basically a Les Paul with a trem, and so
Awesome.
yeah, between
Yeah.
those two.
Yeah. Well, so when it comes to pedals, do you like a lot of pedals or just a simple signal chain? What's going on there?
Um, I love pedals. My main pedal board has just a Klon, and people always ask me like, how do you get away with just having one drive? And I use my volume knob a lot. So
Mm-hmm.
like I'll have like no overdrive with my volume knob down for a clean sound, and then I bring the volume knob up for like a little bit dirt, and then I throw on the Klon for like more of a lead and like a more like kind of, I guess, drive number three. Um, and then I love I love the Memory Man, the 11, I forget what was it called, the 1100, the blue one.
Okay. Yeah.
That's basically the real Memory Man with the tap tempo. I love that. Um, the H9, I couldn't live without an H9. I have a bunch of like pads set up in my H9.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much all I use it for. Is like I have like 10 different pad sounds, and I can create pads. And it's funny because I've actually gotten two keyboard players fired from having that, because like some artists just want to keep keys player just to play between songs and kind of hold a pad. And so the fact that I can do that, they're like, well, we don't need to bring our keys player with us. And so that the H9 is literally just for pads. And I'm kind of obsessed with trying to make like pads that sound like a keyboard is holding it. You know what I mean? Instead of,
Mm-hmm.
it's not swells. I don't like do swells with it. It's just like a constant pad sound. So those, I have to have that. Like I have to have my H9. I have to have Memory Man. I have to have the Klon. And then I've got a smaller board that has the Matthews Effects Architect, which is kind of a Klon type thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I've got three pedal boards, like my main one, my medium one, and my small one, based on like what if if I'm traveling light, or I can bring everything with me.
So Do you worry about redundancy on the road? Like, if this pedal fails, do I need some kind of backup to do this, or you deal with it when that happens?
Um, yeah, I do worry. That's why I bring the Kemper kind of fixes all that because the Kemper has so much stuff in it that if my amp fails, I can switch to the Kemper, and I've got it running in stereo, but it's not a split stereo. It's like the same signal, and
Okay.
so the Kemper, I have like a delay sound dialed up in the Kemper. I've got like a ambient sound dialed up in the Kemper, and I've got like a drive sound dialed up. So I could just manually walk over and switch the sounds if my pedals failed or if my
Right.
amp failed.
So it's a good Swiss Army knife.
Yeah. And every once in a while I'll try to play a show without using pedals, and it makes you feel naked, but it's good practice. It forces you to kind of focus on your playing and not focus on the pedals, because sometimes I get a little bit. For a while, I got a little bit obsessed with pedals, where I was just constantly like messing with pedals and switching stuff out. And now I like to just kind of keep on like a one delay with like a slap back delay, and then an overdrive, and kind of let that be my sound and just focus on playing more.
Right, right. Well, I have one last question I'd like to hit. What would be your advice for a guitarist who wants to get a lot better? Maybe they're just a hobbyist, but they want to get better in whatever context they're playing. What would you advise to help them be the best they can be personally?
Uh, Definitely, my advice is to take jazz lessons.
Okay.
I still get up with my jazz professor once to twice a month, and I've been getting up with him. We just kind of hang out now, but he keeps me up on my chops. But we've been doing that for, it's almost been like 15 years now, and matter of fact, I'll be seeing him this Friday, and he's from Berkeley, and he just whoops my tail. Like, he makes me feel like a little kid, and we have the understanding that I'm just going to completely submit to him. Like, I'm like a puppy that just will do whatever he says. And so I throw my pride out the window, and I just meet up with him, and he just, he's a ridiculous player. And most of the stuff I learned from him, I'm never going to use like on gigs, because it's just like so far out there, with these like altered scales and everything. They just don't sound right on pop gigs.
Right.
But it pushes me. It pushes my ear so far, like to the point where everything else that I play, like, it just feels very comfortable and simple, because, we're just working on these things, like he recently he was showing me this stuff with Lydian flat 7 scales, and it's just like the way he uses them is just blowing my mind. And I tried using it on a gig the other day, and everybody looked at me like I played the worst notes ever. And I'm like, no, I can justify this, like, theoretically, and they're just like, no, that's not terrible. Don't do that again. But yeah, but he just, man, he works me. He shows me voicings. Like, he just knows a million voicings for every chord, and, doing chord melodies and stuff. And it really works me. And it's good to be kind of humbled and put in your place every once in a while. And so,
Yeah.
getting up with somebody one-on-one, like, I would rather spend, $100 on an hour lesson with a guy from Berkeley than spend $100 on a new pedal, because the pedal is never going to make you a better player. But getting up with a one-on-one with a guy that's going to force you to get better, that's going to make you better. So
That's interesting. Yeah, completely surprised by that answer, but I definitely see the credit in doing that.
yeah. So yeah, he works me. But you have some people don't like to be worked like that, and they don't like to be like kind of put in their place. They want to like they want to be like where people are like, "Oh, you sound great," and they don't want to be like, "Well, you're terrible at this. You need to work at this."
Mm-hmm.
But you'll never grow. So it's like it's like going to a physical trainer, that's like working you, that's not letting you kind of slide by, but really working you. So
Yeah, that's
I love it.
interesting. That's interesting. Well, so all the Clifton Worley show listeners, you need to go out and find a jazz professor now.
Yeah, like a real jazz professor. Like there's so many people out there claiming that they're jazz musicians, and you know, it's. I feel like the dude from La La Land. If you've seen that movie, like he's always talking about like real jazz versus like fake jazz, and but yeah,
Cool stuff. Well, thanks, Chris, for taking some time out of your day to chat, and I enjoyed this.
yeah. I could go for another 2 hours.
And we may hit you back later on and recap some stuff. So, well, if anybody,
Yeah.
I'm curious about where could I find some things that you've worked on just to go listen. What would you point somebody?
The most recent thing I did was that Higher Vision with the album with Sean Lochi, and
Okay.
like he let me do lead line on all the guitar work, all the acoustic guitar, all the electric guitar, and all the sax stuff. And like, because a lot of the pop stuff I do, and when you get it back from mixing and mastering, it's like, man, am I even in there?
Right.
Because it's pop stuff. And so this is like the most recent thing that I did where you can really hear the guitar stuff. And he gave me such creative leeway. He just let me do whatever I wanted, and it was pretty cool. And so we pushed the limits of where like a worship album should go as far as like the guitar work on it. So yeah, that would be a great thing. Matter of fact, I'm thinking about piecing together maybe like a highlight reel from that album of just like every song, because a couple people had asked me like what's my favorite lead part on there.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
So that's on iTunes and Spotify and all that jazz. It's called Higher Vision Church, based out in LA.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I'll definitely check that out. Well, thanks, man, again for coming on, and I know our listeners are going to enjoy this.